Good morning. Somebody had their donuts this morning anyway, so we hopefully you got downstairs and were able to get a dose of energy before we start class here. Enjoyed some donuts and coffee. And appreciate those that worked to put that on. We'll be in Ephesians chapter 6 this morning. Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to be looking at the section there. Starts verse 1 and down through verse number 9, and a continuation of our thoughts from last week. Ephesians chapter 6, and then we'll also probably reference over Hebrews chapter 12 if you want to put a marker there as well. We'll be looking at that in conjunction with this. Let's go to God in prayer as we begin. Father in heaven, we thank you. We thank you for who you are. We thank you for blessing us with the church. We thank you for the relationships that we have with each other, the relationships that we have with our family, and what we can learn about you through those relationships. And that we're thankful for just all the ways that you instruct us and guide us and help us to always strive to be a reflection of you in all that we do. Just thank you for your Son. Thank you for sending him to be a sacrifice for us. That's this all in his name. Amen. All right, Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to be looking here at this section again, starting with children and parents, and then into this master and servant relationship. Let's read this first section here, verses 1 through 4 as we begin. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. Father children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Fitting that we end up in this section today on Father's Day, but we have these specific instructions that at least we as parents, Denise and I, we like to teach this to our children, these first couple verses here, and we focus on them, but then there's also the instruction to us as parents as well, specifically fathers called out, although the word could be used as parents in general, but it seems to be an emphasis specifically on the responsibilities of fathers in this section. But when we think about this section, again, keep in mind where we're coming from. This is that last descriptor, again, of being filled with the Spirit. What does that look like? Well, this is submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then we end up we talked about the wife and the husband relationship as we went through that last week. Now we've got children and parents and that relationship. And then finally we'll get to the master and servant relationship, or as we might look at it in today's society, an employer and employee relationship. So all of these relationships that we have with one another ought to be governed by and ought to be a reflection of our relationship with God, our relationship with Christ, and the fact that we live differently because of who we are and because of what's been done for us. So when we get to this section, first we're going to see this idea of children specifically in obeying their parents. So obey, that word obey means to hear under. It's a kind of a combination of two Greek words there. So it's to hear under the authority of someone else, and of course you're looking at obedience. That's the result of that hearing, is what's implied. But there's an expectation for children to obey, and that's something that, you know, as much as it is their responsibility as children, it's our responsibility as parents then to teach them that and to instruct them in a way that they can do that. And so we're going to get into that in just a moment. But it's qualified there in the Lord. And so remember, that's that same phrase. You know, sometimes we think differently of this one, but it's the same phrase that we've been looking at over and over and over throughout the book. And I've heard this explained sometimes as obeying them as they instruct you, I guess, with what's in accordance with God's word. I don't know if that's specifically the emphasis here because it seems it's what's being assumed, much like the previous section. What's being assumed is that we're talking about a Christian home. We're talking about a home where both children and parents are living a life as they are supposed to and living that life and modeling after Christ. And so it seems to be, obey your parents as it would be in accordance with the Lord or would be in accordance with His will. And then we have this idea of this being right. That's the right thing for you to do. That's the right thing for you to do as a child. And that harkens back to chapter 5 and some of the language about, what is right and a right way to live. If you go back and you can kind of trace back some of this language back to the previous chapter. But this is a right thing. This is the right way that they ought to act. And then we have this quotation of an Old Testament command, honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that may be well with you and that you may live long upon the earth there. And that's specifically referencing the command within the Ten Commandments, and the wording there has to do with living long within the land that God would bless them with. That's the specific wording that's being referenced there. And of course, we're pulling that out and making application, or Paul is here to that situation as well, that they may live long on the earth or may live long in the land. He's making a specific, I guess, carrying that forward, and it's not, I guess, making broader application than to living long in the land that God would bless them with, being the promised land. And of course, that was a command that they were given in that when they were going into that land, they were being blessed with things that God was giving them, and for them to continue to enjoy those blessings, they were expected to continue to follow God and continue to follow His commands. And so that fell on children as well, and that fell, and the responsibility of children to continue to live in a way that they were trained, hopefully by their parents, to follow and to honor God. And then as they continued, they were continued to do that, so that those promises would continue to be theirs. And of course, we see that within the Old Testament, that pattern that did not happen. They continually fell away from that, and ultimately lost that the blessing of being there in the land. I think some of my lines are off just a little bit there. But the idea there now, I guess what should be circled there is fathers. So we're moving from children now to fathers. And again, that word for fathers could be and is translated in other places in the New Testament as parents. And so we're looking at specifically fathers being called out, I think because of the context kind of in a way demands it here. But fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So there's this idea of provoking to anger. That's to anger alongside, and so what you end up, I guess it's the idea of you parenting in such a way that your children are have an angry spirit about them. So how is that possible? How can you as a parent do something like that, or how can you instruct your children in such a way, especially fathers, that you could provoke them to anger?
To take out vengeance on their age.
Okay, so if you're parenting in a vengeful with a vengeful type attitude. What else? How else can we provoke to anger? And the other interesting thing about this is, put it in its context, a context of the Greek world where fathers literally owned their children, and now here they're being told to be concerned about their feelings, essentially being concerned about whether or not you're provoking them to anger. So you're taking it in a context to where fathers could do whatever they wanted to with their children. They could kill them. I mean, that would be within their rights as parents or fathers. They would be within their rights But now he's saying, don't provoke them to anger. And so consider their feelings. So this is a very unique thing within this context. But how else could we do that? I mean, so maybe you're vengeful. What's that? Teaching them hatred. Okay. So maybe you're instructing them, maybe by our attitude and by our actions, you end up teaching them hatred in that way. Okay, so you could punish them harder than needed. So you can be overly harsh. You could be overly harsh and overly strict. That would be one way of provoking them to anger.
Also
Being a hypocrite.
do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, so you're instructing them in a certain way, and you're not allowing them, to make the same mistakes that you make or to do the same things that you're doing. Okay, good. So we're looking about within the instruction of the Lord. We're talking about agape love here, and so I think there's two pieces to this, and so you can be overly harsh. Let's see here. You can be overly harsh, but it's contrasted with what you're not supposed to do is bring them up or to provoke them to anger. But what you are supposed to do is to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So if you're not bringing them up with discipline and instruction specifically of the Lord, but within this, if you're not disciplining and instructing, if you're giving too much freedom, could that provoke to anger as well? If you're an absentee, if you're not involved, if you're not giving instruction, if you're not disciplining, that's another extreme here, and I think both extremes can fall into this trap of causing the child to become angry, because that's part of it. If we're not instructing, if we're not giving clear instruction to our children, then we're going to anger them in that way. This idea of bringing them up. And I hope that some of you older parents will speak up within this. I mean, I'm still cutting my teeth on this, I guess, as far as being a parent. And so I don't stand here before you as someone who's been through all of this. And so I would hope that some of you who are older, who have raised children through to adulthood, would chime in on some of this as well. But we have this idea of bringing them up, and that's to rear them up to maturity, to cherish or to train. And so that's an intentional thing that we're bringing them up and we're trying to raise them up to maturity. Sometimes we can raise children and try to keep them dependent on us. And some parents will do that. They'll raise them up and try to keep them to where they're dependent because that gives them a sense of value. But that's not what we're being called to do here. We're supposed to bring them up or to rear them up to maturity, to bring them up and to train them in that way. The idea of discipline here is a word that the Greeks would use, would be training in all aspects of life to help them to come to be a good citizen. And so the discipline here is a tutoring, an education, a training. It's something that's bringing them in a certain direction. Is discipline different than punishment? What's the difference?
Discipline can be imposed or self-discipline.
Okay.
Instructions is, this is what is written down to do.
All right, discipline and punishment. All right, so punishment, sorry. Yeah. Discipline and punishment. That was good. So, but what would be the difference between discipline and punishment? Okay. Okay, so discipline would include punishment, but is punishment always discipline?
Would you say self-control would be discipline, like teaching self-control?
Okay.
Punishment would be the consequence of the lack of the self-control?
Good. And that's kind of what you're looking at here is discipline is something that you're looking into the future. Punishment's kind of looking back into the past, right? So if you're disciplining a child, if you're bringing them up, you have a goal in mind. You have something that you're trying to bring about. Punishment, you're looking back in the future, and so discipline could include punishment. But punishment is simply, here's an action that I do not like, and I'm going to punish for that action. But doesn't necessarily have an end goal in mind. So if we're not careful, we can get really good at punishing our children. And so there are certain behaviors or things that we punish, certain behaviors that we would correct, but we don't really have a goal in mind. We don't know where we're going. We don't have an end goal where we're trying to get our children to this point. And so that's the more difficult thing about this. I think it's easy to fall into a mindset of, here's a behavior I don't like, here's a behavior that irritates me, here's a behavior that angers me, and I'm going to correct that behavior. Rather than, here's where I want my child to be, here are attributes that I want my child to have. And again, this is all in the Lord, or in the direction of, it's instruction of the Lord. So we're going towards the direction of making them to be more like Christ. So we have an end goal in mind, and we're disciplining, and we're bringing them up and bringing them in that direction. And again, it's real easy for us to kind of have a mindset about parenting that's not so much about the direction where we're going, it's about what kind of mood we're in. So I'm angry, or I'm in a bad mood, I had a hard day at work, I had external circumstances that I'm going through personally influence how I respond to my children. But what's supposed to be there's supposed to be a direction to this. You're trying to raise them up, to train them up to maturity, to discipline them, and you're bringing them from being a child who's completely dependent upon you, who's completely self-centered and wants, that's kind of the attitude that children have from the very beginning, is everything is about them. Well, you've got to bring them from that to being a selfless individual who looks more like Christ. So you're disciplining them is bringing them through all of that, all of those, the middle ground there, to bring them to the point to where they look more and more like Christ. So that's would be my, I guess, how I would describe the difference between punishment and discipline there. So we're looking at a direction, and again, we're looking at something that our discipline and our instruction has an end goal in mind. Other thoughts specifically on that distinction, or things that you've seen as parents, or things, yes? Yes, and so that's where you're getting them to the point that they are self-disciplined, or I guess I might even say that you're transferring the discipline from the parent to God. Ultimately, we can talk about self-discipline and being under our own self-will, but as Christians, really, that's not what we're about, really, is it? We're not about putting ourselves under our own authority. We're about taking what we have and placing it under God's authority. So we're transitioning them from one authority figure to another. It can be self, and I think sometimes that gets overemphasized in our society, is that our self-direction and where we want to go and our own personal goals and things that we want out of this life kind of trump what God would have us to do. So there's a tendency for us as in this society to do that. We're going to train them up to serve themselves. But again, that's not discipline and instruction of the Lord. If we're talking about discipline and instruction of the Lord, we're talking about placing them under the authority of God and being not self-serving, but self-sacrificing people who are going to serve God. What else? Right. And so we can take the proverb, train them up in the way they should go, and when they're not old, they will not depart from it. We can make that a rule and not a proverb. So a proverb is something that's generally true, but ultimately, we all have free will. Ultimately, we all decide for ourselves who we are going to serve, if we're going to serve ourselves or if we're going to serve King Jesus. And so that's ultimately, there's a choice on their behalf. But if we take that proverb of, do this and you get this result, that's something that's generally true, not necessarily a rule. What else? So we're looking at this, some questions, I would ask is what are you disciplining towards? What direction are you disciplining towards? So we can discipline our children to be good consumers, to be those who go out and take things for themselves and consume resources around them. We can raise them to be good in academics. That can be the discipline that we're imposing. We're raising them in that direction. We could talk about sports. But again, all of this, in everything that we do, whether it's academics or sports or whatever direction, we're disciplining them ultimately towards the direction of God. Should be. Not to say that we do that all the time perfectly. Sometimes we kind of get things out of order. So again, examining ourselves and looking at, what kind of behavior do I correct? Am I simply correcting behavior that irritates me? I just want you to be less loud. You ever experienced that? I just want things to be a little quieter, right? And so sometimes that's what we start. That's the only thing we end up correcting is just something that irritates us physically. How do I correct? Am I correcting harshly? Am I overly harsh in my correction? Am I overly harsh in my reaction to things? Do I correct more in the way that we would see and we would want to be corrected ourselves? Do we let them experience grace from us? Do we show that to them? So we teach that God is a God of grace, and God is a God who extends grace to us and forgiveness. Do we show that to them in the way that we parent? What kind of routine do we have? Think about being disciplined. It starts with us, and what kind of routine do we have? How disciplined are we as parents in the way that we carry out our daily lives? And so if our routine is one that we're constantly doing things that are serving ourselves, but then we're trying to get them to serve others, well, that's hypocrisy, like Andrew talked about earlier. That's kind of talking in two directions, and so that's something that could provoke to anger. Hebrews chapter 12, I think is something that's interesting as we study a passage talking about discipline, and we're talking about fathers specifically and how they ought to discipline their children. We have Hebrews chapter 12. The Hebrews writer actually talks about us being disciplined by God. And so it's really interesting when you think about, should we discipline, and then how does God discipline? So look at verse number 5, and we'll read down through this section. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastens every son he receives. It is this discipline that you have to endure. God is training you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? No, it's interesting here. This is a talking about this as something that's just a given. If you have a child, then you're going to discipline him. That's a given. What son is it for whom the father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we had earthly fathers who disciplined us, we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us, and this is one that always sticks out to me in my mind. They disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. And so that you see kind of the imperfection that we're going to have as earthly fathers. We discipline our children as it seems best to us. We do the best that we can, or we're trying to raise up our children in a certain way, and so we're doing it in a way that seems best to us. But God, He disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to all those who have been trained by it. So we're being disciplined by God if we are His children. If we're not being disciplined by God, then we are illegitimate, is what the Hebrews writer says. So when we go through bad circumstances in life, what we perceive as bad, a lot of times what happens is we look at God and say, why am I going through this? Why do I have to do this? Why am I enduring this pain? And really, we probably ought to be asking the question, if we're not going through hardships, why am I not being disciplined? Why am I not being chastened? Do you not love me? Am I an illegitimate child? I mean, that's kind of what the Hebrews writer is saying. If you're going through hardships, that's something that, God is disciplining you. God is bringing you through those things in order to train you in a certain direction. The Hebrews writer is writing to a group of people who are going through persecution, who are going through trials, and that's the context in which he's talking about this. So, we have to endure some sort of hardship, some sort of pain, some sort of trials in this life in order to grow. Which brings us to our children. Do we allow them to do that, to go through those things? Or do we protect them from any kind of pain, any kind of trial, any kind of hardship? It's tempting as parents to see our children going through difficult times and to bail them out of every situation and to protect them in every way that we can. But sometimes the trials that we go through are what trains us, or those are the things that train us to be the people that God wants us to be. So in this way, when we're training our children, we're doing what God does with us. And so looking at God's example of how He trains us and the things that we have to go through in order for what? What's the ultimate goal? Again, it says heaven. So it says, they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but He disciplines us for our good, that we may share His holiness. We're becoming more like God. We're sharing in God's holiness. That's what God wants for us. That's what God wants. God wants us to be more like Him, that He wants us to share in His holiness. That's what we ought to want for our children. We can want for them to be good athletes. We can want for them to do well in the school and all of these other areas of life. But if that's our main focus and not their holiness, then we're missing the mark. We ought to be training, and again, the training and instruction, the discipline and instruction is in the direction of God. And so we're leading them with a goal and not just leading them based off of our mood. What other comments or thoughts do we have?
I think we have to keep in mind also what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, as far as allowing our children to experience those things. We don't want them to have more put on than they can bear.
Right.
So, there's a line there that once we allow them to suffer through, we've got to make a decision there as parents as to, we can't just leave them out there to dry.
Let me ask you a question. So I don't know if you heard. So the comment was, the Hebrew or 1 Corinthians 10:13, God will not suffer us to be tempted more than what we can bear. And that's put on parents, and I can see that to a certain extent, especially with very, very young children. But who's not going to allow them to be tempted more than they can bear? The parents or God? And can God do that without us? Yeah, it should be both. But I'm saying we can place too much of that on ourselves. I don't know. I'm trying to think through this, and this is one of those things. I wish we were in a small classroom setting because this would be a good conversation to have. But so we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves to carry this out perfectly, but God's ultimately controlling that and is not going to allow that individual to be tempted past the point that they can bear.
There's going to be a tendency for a parent to protect.
Right.
But we have to, as parents, make a discernment as
Right.
to what's going to allow them to grow or what's going to keep them at the top.
Right.
At some point, we're going to have to improve.
Right.
And to mature, we're going to have to suffer those things. The knocks and the bruises that we get along life's way is what makes us who we are.
Right.
But we don't want to subject them to a degree that causes them to give up.
Yeah.
Blame God for things that God's not doing.
Right. Yeah, I think there's definitely an instruction that has to come along with that. And again, we don't want to put them in a position to where they start to blame God for the things that they're going through and to start looking at God in that way. And I think that's one of those things where they learn that, they should learn that from us and the things that we go through and seeing how we react to certain situations. When we go through difficult times, what do we do? How do we react to those things? How do we show that we trust God even through difficulties and look for ways that we can grow even in those difficult circumstances? So there's going to be times in our life when we are enduring a great hardship, and if our attitude before our children is, how can we grow through this, and talking through those things with our children and trying to study through those things with our children, or if we're responding in a way of why me, there's a big difference between those two things. And I think that's a big way that we can do that as well. Yes.
All of us as parents want to keep our children out of harm's way. And we have to make decisions when things come up to do this. Unfortunately, we enter parenthood with no experience whatsoever.
Yeah.
And by the time that we get to where we think we're pretty good, they're out of our house. So it's a learning experience, parenthood. We need to do what you're talking about this morning. Go to the instructions that God has left for us, and look at that, and then do the best that we can.
Yeah, and I think, we talk about, children don't come with an instruction manual. We start out, we don't know what we're doing. And you say by the time they leave your house, you feel like you're getting pretty good at it. I feel like I'm getting worse at it every day. I feel like I'm going in the more I know, the more I realize. Oh, okay, all right, that's what it is. So when they get about 20, I'm smarter in my eyes, but that's when they think that I'm not smart, I guess, right? That's the time when they reject everything, or those years before that. But I think part of this is that, we've talked a lot about in this class about this idea of community and about how we ought to be, people who are studying God's Word together. We ought to be helping each other. This is an area where I, as a young parent, I don't know, I say I'm a young parent. I don't know how I'm viewed or in that way. I still consider myself a young parent. We need help from those of you who've been through those things. So Brother Franklin, you're smart at this point because your kids are older than 20, and so I need you to come alongside me and help me in the ways that I'm messing up. I need you to see the things that I'm doing and spend enough time with me to know, hey, what you did there, if you could do it this way, that might help them more so, or hey, I noticed that you did this, but we're too sensitive, right? So you don't want to tell me that because you're afraid you'll hurt my feelings maybe, and then and that maybe I'm not receptive enough or humble enough to take that criticism, those constructive criticism at times. But that ought to be the way that we live within community, is to help each other along, and to, that's Titus, right? I mean, we're talking about older women instructing the younger women, older men helping and instructing the younger men. That's the way that this ought to work. But what ends up happening is we have children and we figure it out on our own. We figure it out on our own when we have a whole community around us who's been there and done that. And that's kind of sad. I'm not saying it's the older generation's fault. And I don't know that it is any more than it's our fault, because sometimes, again, we have an attitude where we're not humble enough to accept that. But sometimes that's not given. You have to go and search out that help as well. And so, as anybody in here sees anything that I'm doing with my children, please, you've been there and you've done that. Again, I'm younger and I'm inexperienced. So help me along. Help me as you see those things. And then as I get older and I see things that, that people with younger children, I'm going to help them along and help to guide them. And that ought to be the way that we live within the community of the church. And so, in a way, then, if we live that way, there is an instruction manual. We have those who went before us, who've lived this out, who've gone through all of this, and they're helping us along, and we're not going at this blindly. Yeah, see, but you know everything. So your kids, yeah. 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 I won't tell Denise if you tell me. Yes. Right. Yeah, and I agree. That's what I'm saying. I think it goes both ways, right? I mean, again, the younger generation has to be humble enough to accept that advice, and the old generation needs to be, well, number one, needs to have a relationship with them to the point that they can give that advice. Because if I don't have a relationship with you, and the only time I see you is on Sunday morning. Yeah, okay. You just didn't have a relationship with the wife, apparently. So but, yeah. Right. Well, and it's definitely, I mean, like I say, it's a difficult thing to take criticism. I mean, it's a very, very difficult thing, and some people, it's harder for some people than others. And again, I think that all that comes. It's hard to give criticism, and it's hard to take it. It's hard on both sides. But if we're not doing that, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. Again, if I'm not receptive enough, that I'm doing myself a disservice, and if you're not going to offer instruction, then you're doing me a disservice. And so I know that's not always reality. And so don't think that I'm saying that. I'm saying that there's fault on both sides of the aisle here, and so that we need to be more willing to work together in this area. Yes?
I think you touched on a point that us as Christians, we need to help one another. It may not be giving instructions that this is the way you need to be doing it, but to help. Yeah. If you see a family that's, they've got 3 or 4 kids and they're having trouble, keeping things in order, they've got their hands full, give them a hand, help them, not necessarily tell them what they're doing wrong or, how they might be better able to do something, but help them to do it.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of just coming alongside and working together and helping one another that could be done. And I don't know that it's necessarily, you said 3 or 4 kids, but we'll let the people that just have 2 kids, we'll let them have a little help too, I guess, maybe. But No, there's something that happens from 2 to 3. That was, I don't know, that was our struggle. I don't know if it was Kyle, if that was your, oh, it was 0 to 1. Yeah, 0 to 1. That was a big jump. 2 to 3 was another hard one because all of a sudden you're outnumbered, and 3 to 4 wasn't so bad. But yeah, the struggle there, especially early on, is more of if you want to come alongside and help the parents get some sleep. Normally will do a lot of good, and so that's where we struggled. I feel like early on, physically, was just getting enough sleep. But everybody deserves 3. There you go. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot here as we talk about this, and we look at raising children, as we look at our attitudes as children towards our parents and honoring them the way that we ought to. That's not constrained by time, by the way. That honoring your father and mother, that's something that ought to carry out throughout life. So that would apply to all of us, because all of us are children of someone. But as parents, you know, there's definitely a cooperative effort there. There ought to be. I mean, we ought to be helping one another. We ought to be, again, those of you who are older, you know, come and help in any way. I mean, I would welcome, you know, I would welcome any advice or anything of that nature. Just give it to Denise and not me. That way, you know, no, but you know, all of this is, I think, kind of highlights the lack of relationships that we have sometimes, the lack of a corporate spirit that we're working together. I think that is somewhat highlighted here when we think about this, and we think about how we are to do this, and just the fact that it's so overwhelming when you start having children. Like Brother Franklin said, you go into it with no instruction manual. You don't know what you're doing. And so having someone come alongside and help and give instruction, give advice, that's definitely would be or should be welcomed. Not that it would always be welcome, but I think you've got to have that relationship for that to happen. All right. Yes. What's that? A lot of time at the grandparents. Okay, all right. I'll tell Mom. So you hear that? A lot of time with the grandparents. Listen to them whistle. We got back, so Denise and I left for one night. The first thing we heard when we got back is, boy, they whistle a lot. And so, yeah, I mean, you get to listen to them whistle and hear all those things. But yeah, they, and I think there's a role for grandparents there as well. I think that's part of it as well. There's a role for not only grandparents, but within the congregation. I mean, you know, we're all a family, and so, you know, I welcome you to help to discipline and train my children. If you see them doing something that they ought not be doing, I would hope that you would correct them and for that. And so sometimes we don't see all the things, and sometimes we need help seeing something that's being done that needs to be corrected. So feel free to correct if you see something, as far as for my children. And I think others would agree with that. But any other comments or anything? I thought we might get through the next section, but I think our time was well spent this morning talking about this. All right. Well, we'll pick up there with the servant and master section, verse number 5, next week, Lord willing. Thank you.